with webcasting. Chair, we're now live.
Wonderful, thanks Gary, and good morning everyone, and welcome to this morning's Rail North Committee that we're holding virtually. Lovely to see everyone again today for what I think will be a very busy and significant meeting with some of the items on the agenda that we're going to deal with. Obviously the first item is for the welcome, which I think we've just covered, but apologies for absence. So David, who have we had apologies from so we can note accordingly?
We had apologies from Councillor Gannon from the North East, Mayor Houchan from Tees Valley, Councillors Les and Duncan from North Yorkshire, and Councillors Waltham and Hannigan from South Humber.
Lovely, thank you. And I'm assuming there's no further apologies anyone wants to announce. Otherwise, we can move nicely on to the second item, being declarations of interest. That's obviously the standard reminder for anyone that if they do have anything that they need to declare at this moment in time, please indicate. Or if at any time during the debate and discussion of the meeting, anything kind of crops up that is declarable, please make sure that you notify us accordingly. And I'm not seeing any indications, so I'll take it that there aren't any. Third item is the meetings of the previous, the minutes of the previous meeting. Can we agree those as an accurate record of our meeting that we held virtually on the 31st of May? Is that agreed? I'm not seeing any dissent, so we can take that as such. Right, let's move into the substantive items. And I think what we were going to propose to do is that if we take items 4, the future of rail in the north, and items 5 as the same collective item, because they do effectively cover much of the same issues. So what I was going to do is, first of all, ask David to introduce both items, but then we've got a number of operator colleagues with us. I know we've got Steve Montgomery, who heads up First Rail Division, who will be giving us an update on both Avanti and TP, and May, in his role as the chair of the Rail Delivery Group, might want to give some reflections on the industry as a whole. We've also got Matthew Galton as the Managing Director of TransPennine Express. He'll perhaps give us a little bit more detail on that. And also Nick Donovan as Managing Director of Northern, who will give us a Northern perspective. And in the interests of sort of punctuality and reliability, gents, if we can try to keep everyone's contribution to about 3 to 5 minutes, so we've got enough time for debate and discussion. Because I think we're going to cover some very significant issues, I'm going to suggest that we probably may need to sort of take up to an hour on this item. So, yeah, when we get towards 12 noon, I'll try to kind of draw things to a close if things are still being debated and discussed. But I do think there's a lot of very significant issues that will need airing this morning. So, David, if I can pass over to you first, please.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So in the first paper, The Future of Rail, we tried to draw together some of the themes that come up in the operational update and others, and propose a set of recommendations, which I think, Chair, you're suggesting you come back to after you've heard from the operators. But just to outline what the report covers. Firstly, it outlines the strong bounce back in demand that we've seen in the north, which at the latest figures was about 87% of pre-COVID at North of England stations, compared to 71% in London. Northern were about 90% of pre-COVID demand, TPE a bit lower, about 73%. But both operators have had a big bounce back in leisure travel. Northern have seen 100% regularly on leisure travel. So the growth has been there, but I think we all know, and it's very clear from the papers and people's experience, that performance at the moment is unacceptable, and it's stifling potentially that recovery and that good work in terms of growing back and growing the markets. We've got not only reduced timetables in the baseline from Northern and TPE and Avanti we've seen as well, but we've also got a very high level of on the day or day before in some cases cancellations, which is having a real impact on people's lives. I'm sure we'll hear from members later on around that in terms of the impacts that it's having. We've actually done some calculations that are highlighted in the report, where we put the cost of delays on TransPennine Express alone to be around £2 million a week. We've actually extended that to look at Northern as well, and we think the total is probably at least £8 million a week, just in terms of the cost of delays from the current levels of performance. And that's really, really significant levels, and that doesn't actually include any Avanti figures at the moment either. So the report tries to really gather a way forward for the committee to consider out of the current position, and groups it in three sort of themes really. The first of which is obviously most importantly addressing the current performance issues, and it highlights the need for, particularly on TransPennine Express, some flexibility for the management team to agree some short-term mitigations, particularly around discussing with unions and staff the use of rest day working that isn't available to them at the moment, that would be a way of covering some of the high levels of sickness and some of the shortfalls in trained drivers that are actually available. And of course this stems back to COVID and other issues and some of the high levels of sickness that have been seen, but it is the training for a driver takes so long to get through the pipeline, 18 to 24 months, that we've seen this situation before. It's come to a head now, but really we're saying that actually what is needed here is a long-term solution to skills for the industry. So one of the core recommendations is about backing the academy for the North, training academy for the North Rail industry, with a particular focus, at least in the short term, on that pipeline of drivers. So we're not in this position, and seeking funding to get that up and running off the ground based on the really good work that Northern have done at the moment. But it would cover all operators in the north of England. And then very importantly, through the Rail North Partnership, which we have working on our behalf jointly with DfT, we'd make sure that operators are very closely monitored and held to account for whatever sort of commitments you might hear today in terms of restoring services. We have a number of tools around that. I think they're different for the different operators. In the case of Avanti, we can make statutory advice to the Secretary of State in terms of how we think the contract should be managed, but we're not actually a party to that. Whereas in the case of Northern and TPE, through the Rail North Partnership, we do have a route to make our views very, very clear. But ultimately, contractual matters and matters of enforcement are reserved matters for the Secretary of State. But we do have some tools there around ensuring that performance does improve in the way that operators will set out to us. The second sort of key area is drawing on some of the frustrations of, I think, not having the tools and the levers in the North, and looking at how the North could have greater say in the future in the management of rail operations and the development of services, and actually building on some of the powers we have through the Rail North Partnership at the moment, but actually putting out some stronger initiatives, and actually building on some positives that we've done around regional business units, for example, giving local elected mayors more say, local authorities more control in the way that contracts are managed, but actually things like rolling out fares reform, pay-as-you-go ticketing, and building on some of the really good work on stations. We think there's a really powerful offer, particularly with the delays, slight uncertainty about what's happening with Great British Railways. We think actually there's the potential for us to put a really strong offer and develop that for the board when they meet next month in terms of rail reform, but giving the North, as I say, more say and more control on how things work. The third sort of theme is a financial one. I think we're all very conscious. We've got the autumn statement coming up in a couple of days, but there are concerns, deep concerns about the level of funding that's going to be available, not only for capital investment that we've heard a lot about, but also for just for the funding for keeping rail services running, and supporting that growth we've seen. And the alternative is faced with very difficult choices around cutting rail services, which I'm sure nobody wants to be in that position. But actually, really what we're coming back to is the same sort of offer that we made to government back in 2015, which was actually invest to grow the markets. The only way to reduce the overall call on subsidy in the North is to get more revenue, more people travelling. That meets our kind of wider objectives of social inclusion, decarbonisation. But to do that, you've actually got to make sure you fund services and invest in growth, and then you will see more revenue return and benefits all round. So I think there's quite an offer that we can put back here, drawing on some of the really strong evidence we've got now from things like the Northern Independent Economic Review to show the value of rail in the North, and there's some figures in the report. I know Northern have produced some figures, TPE are doing the same, and we're looking at a kind of pan-Northern value of rail in the North. So quite a lot in the Chair. That's an outline of the recommendations. I think the suggestion was that you move to operator updates next and then come back to those recommendations.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think that's a very helpful outline of the situation. Can I turn first to Steve Montgomery, as head of First Group's rail division, to give us his update on behalf of Avanti TP and perhaps also some reflections from the rail delivery group. So, Steve, great to have you. Over to you for a few minutes.
Okay, Chair, thank you, and thank you to the committee for the invite to come along today. First of all, we understand the challenges that there is out there at this present time, and we do, and I've been out there and I've publicly apologised to customers and to stakeholders that this is a difficult challenge, and I'll cover a little bit of the industry part first, and it maybe puts in context the local challenges that we see. Clearly, the reform of the industry is in various stages at this moment in time, where we are having good levels of engagement with the trade unions to try and look at reform, but obviously members of staff, our staff, RMT, ASLEF and the other unions members are clearly looking for a significant pay increase. And we're working as fast as we can with the trade unions, with government, to try and get some form of reform that allows us to put a proposal to staff that gives them a pay increase. And that in itself is actually impacting and causing some of the disquiet we see across, not just in the north, but the whole of the industry, of where we have seen industrial action and, through RMT, through ASLEF and TSSA, and that is obviously impacting on customers' confidence. Now, if you overlay that with the situation, I'll start with Advanti. The situation with Advanti, clearly from July, when the national dispute was announced, quite quickly after that, within a matter of days, that we've seen the level of staff who were available to work additional overtime shifts, which we are relying on, or were relying on, that fell away, and people are entitled to their day off, and we understand that. But the big problem with Advanti, like a lot of operators at this moment in time, is they're catching up on their drivers' training duty. As David said earlier, the COVID situation and the length of time it actually takes to train a driver. It is not, certainly for TPE and for Advanti, there is not a shortage of drivers. We have got more drivers employed in both those businesses than were there pre-pandemic, and actually the most number of drivers ever employed in the businesses. But it is the length of time that it's taking us to get those drivers productive, and that's a challenge we face at this moment. There's been significant pieces of work done over the last number of months as we put the recovery plan in Advanti. That recovery plan is ongoing, and we continue to work towards that. Like the rest of the industry, we are currently in the final discussions with introducing the drivers' rosters for the December timetable, and that is ongoing and kicked off this week with discussions with the representatives. So we are hopeful that that is concluded in a favourable way, and then allows us to prepare properly for reintroducing services in December, particularly on Advanti, and we understand that the pressures that we have had with that and the impact that it's having in people's livelihoods. Also in TPE, a very similar circumstances, and Matt will say a little bit more about this, of where we have, again, significant amounts of training that are ongoing, not just on drivers becoming productive, but obviously the amount of training for route diversions and, the Manchester route upgrades that we're seeing. So these things have impacted quite significantly, but you have our assurances that everybody is working exceptionally hard to ensure that we try and restore the services that were promised in December. So that's all I'll say at the moment, Chair, and then can take questions after everybody else has spoken, if that's how you want to do it.
That's very helpful. Thanks for that, Steve. Much appreciated. Matthew, do you want to give us a little bit of an update from a TPE perspective as well please, for the next couple of minutes?
Sure. Thank you, Chair. There's obviously a very comprehensive paper, agenda item 5, that Gary Bogan and David submitted, which outlines the key constraints that we've been working through this year, and those that aren't in our direct control, but clearly important to the service that we deliver. Just want to say thank you to TfN for the work they've been doing with us over developing wider understanding of those challenges. As Steve said, we've had a really intensive programme of.
Do you remember when yesterday I said I was going to
training?
Sorry about that, Matthew. I think someone wasn't on mute, so back to you.
Right, they've had a really intensive programme of train crew training. That's really threefold for us at TPE, and we're probably more affected than any other operator in the north. I mean, clearly there's the making up the pandemic-induced backlog. There's also critically getting ready for the Transpennine route upgrade. Steve talked about the diversionary knowledge that we need for that, because we are very affected. And crucially, getting ready for this important December timetable change, which this committee and the members represented on it have set a lot of store by, and asked for many of the things that we want to stand up in December. As Steve said, we've got more train crew than we've ever had before. By example, we've got 577 drivers and trainees on the books. 500 of those are competent. We're aiming to have 509 competent drivers by the December timetable change, and then we've got a steady stream of trainees and new recruits qualifying, and by the time we get to the end of March, we want to have another 20 competent drivers over and above the numbers that we'll have at the December timetable change. Still got some gaps in train crew competency, working very, very hard to make that up. Doing that training this year against the backdrop that we've had with sickness, the absence of driver rest day working, and some of the other challenges that we've had this year, we know have been impactful. I just want to echo what Steve has said. We are sorry where that has had impacts on customers and stakeholders, and we understand the frustration that has caused. During the autumn, by the start of the autumn, we saw cancellations at the lowest level since May. As we progressed through the autumn, it's become more challenging. We saw a doubling in the number of non-TPE generated incidents, a sad increase in that mix of fatalities on the railways. And apart from the tragedy that's involved for individuals and families, unfortunately, that has an impact on railway colleagues as well. And we've got 6 train crew unavailable for duties as a result. My team are working flat out to deliver the improvements. Since we last met, we made a temporary adjustment to our services on the West Coast. That's brought greater stability. It's had a significant impact on the number of cancellations. We will be having more crews becoming competent between now and the 12th of December, and I promised in the discussions that we had with key stakeholders over the summer that we would be raising the daily number of services back in December, and we will go back to 35 services, and when we get to May, we'll be going back to 40. Finally, Chair, the December timetable's got some very significant new journey opportunities in it. Hull to Liverpool, Cleethorpes to Liverpool, the reintroduction of TPE services via Warrington, Saltburn frequency. It also gets new trains onto the South route. It's important that we stand that timetable up. That's what we've been working to. That's what we are planning to do. It will be demanding at its outset. As Steve said, we will still have spikes of sickness. We've still got train crew coming through. But as we add competence and as we add depth, then services will get better week by week as we go forward. As Steve mentioned, we've got the discussions with trade union colleagues over rosters and diagrams. That's an important part of the process that we're just completing off. I hope people attest that I've been honest and transparent all the way through the year in talking with local authorities and key stakeholders about the challenges that we're facing. As part of that dialogue, we've talked about all the ingredients that we need for a resilient operation. We talked about our ongoing readiness work, and I've also talked about some of the potential contingencies that we might need to deploy. For example, the temporary changes to some of our late overnight services in the first couple of months of the timetable. I hope that's helpful, Chair, and I'll pause now. Thank you.
No, that's great. Thank you, Matthew. Nick, do you want to complete the operator triumvirate, please?
Certainly will. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to come and discuss these important matters today. So, highlights for me. So, strong customer demand. I think we talked about that early on. We're around about 90% of the 2019 volume levels now, and leisure continuing to dominate. Although, of course, impacted by industrial action and the service delivery challenges, and I'll focus on some of that in what I'm going to say over the next couple of minutes. Before I mention that, revenue round about 2019 levels actually, and we had our best ever week, other than a couple of Christmas weeks just recently. So certainly the market is there, but clearly, and we recognise the future growth intrinsically linked to stronger delivery across the region. And performance, of course, is right at the heart of that. So I think colleagues have extended apologies for challenges in the delivery over recent months, and I will share that as well, of course, on behalf of the team here for where we haven't quite got that right. So I just wanted to sort of briefly touch on short, medium and long-term issues actually around our performance delivery. So in the short term, some good progress has been made. We had a rostering disagreement dating back to May with our drivers, which has been resolved. That was resolved at the end of October, and that has enabled an immediate uptick, certainly in West and Central, in terms of performance delivery. Although must acknowledge that challenges remain for Sunday services, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. We do continue to have some local challenges, principally driven around sickness. The North East certainly is an area where we've been putting an immense amount of focus and scrutiny in terms of the sickness position, a lot of management effort there. And in fact, we are sharing some good practice, or about to share some good practice with others in terms of our approach to that particular challenge. And I'll touch on some numbers for improvements on that shortly. In the medium term, whilst the rostering disputes have been resolved, probably just acknowledge the absence of rest day working does continue to challenge our ability to deliver long-term train crew efficiency. So not significant for us in that we planned around no rest day working within the business for most of this year. But for the ability to get under the skin of some of the training, route and traction knowledge training, which reduces our train crew efficiency and resilience in some of the performance delivery and smoothing out some of the absence peaks. Long term, and I think Steve acknowledged the broader industry reform matters. Certainly getting the right terms that protect our long-term delivery, and especially around Sundays into the working week. For members might be interested that 95% of our train crew in West and Central do not have Sundays in the working week, and that gives us a particular challenge in terms of surety of delivery on the Sunday service. So we've, in spite of the rostering disagreement conclusion, we'll continue to see some challenges in that area. Just unpacking a few details then on sickness. Roughly we are at about 5.2% absence at the moment, slightly averse to target, but some peaks. And I mentioned the North East. The North East has been up as high as 9% in terms of sickness in period 5. The work that we've been doing with the management team there has reduced that to about 6.8% in period 7. So still higher than it needs to be to support resilient delivery, but an improving position. So immense amount of focus going on in that area. In terms of driver training, I know it's a conversation that often is had around have we got enough drivers and so on. I'm certain we have. We've built our establishment of qualified drivers from about 1,700 in March 2020 to just over 1,800 just now. We're forecast to recruit another 154 drivers over the next 12 months. And the new entrant pipeline responds to forecast attrition of about 138 leavers over the next 12 months, leaving to roles in other TOCs. And actually 35 have left us recently for roles in other operators. But certainly we are planning our train crew recruitment profile to address those forecast leavers numbers. And you're really pleased, and thank you, David, for the mention on the academy. And certainly, we're really pleased to be and supportive to get engaged with moving that forward. In terms of delivery of training on route and traction knowledge training, in September 2020, we had about 12,000 days of training outstanding in the portfolio. We've reduced that, in spite of the rest day working challenge, by about 25%. Over the last couple of years. So we have made some good progress on that matter, especially in the east of the business. Just a couple of quick comments, I think, on December 22 coming up. I know, Chair, there's a paper later on, but I think it's worth reflecting that in terms of the overall performance position. That December timetable change is going to be critical to us in terms of the structure of the timetable, which will be more implicitly reliable. By way of example, one of our train crew resourcing arrangements reduces the number of train crew changes in the centre of Manchester. That itself will structurally support a more robust delivery. And we're just working through at the moment, as other operator colleagues are, the negotiations on the rosters, which are going reasonably well. We're just navigating at the moment some risks in terms of the phased introduction of services that we've talked about before, and how that plays into those negotiations, and the actual detail about how we introduce those services over the first couple of weeks of that timetable, moving to the plan, the full long-term plan. So I think that is probably it for me, Chair, in terms of an update, and happy to take questions.
That's great. Thanks for that, Nick, Matthew and Steve, for your contributions. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and comments if I can see indications from members accordingly. Lovely. Keith, do you want to start us off? Keith, are you there? In Cumbria?
Yeah, I am.
Lovely.
I put my camera on instead of my mic. Thanks, everybody, and nice to be joining you this morning. Mine is, and I fully understand the difficulty of the situation. I've been a trade unionist all my life, so I have some sympathies, but I also have sympathies with management as well. But an issue that I raised at a recent meeting was train cancellations in the mornings. And that results in the following trains that are coming down the line having to pick up many more passengers who have patiently waited for the next available train. And the same happened over the weekend for other members of my family going down to London for the Remembrance Day celebration. So 2 trains for Avanti Northwest were cancelled on the morning, and they were informed by staff on the station platform that they would be able to catch the 9 o'clock train rather than the 8 o'clock train. But seats wouldn't be available probably, as 2 earlier trains had been cancelled. And they resulted in standing quite a long way, even with young children, on this service. And as I said earlier, I do have some sympathies with the TOCs, but it's driving people away from having any sense of reliability in getting to the train station to catch the train that's scheduled for them to get down and get on with the business or the leisure or business that they need to get on with. And I don't know what can be done about it, Liam. I really don't. The TOCs say it's driver situations, it's sickness situations. We understand there are plenty of people in the system but for the travelling public, it isn't getting any better at this point in time. Thanks, Liam.
Okay, thanks, Keith. I think that's very helpful comments. I'm just conscious that because we've got a number of contributions, should we move on to Jamie next?
Thanks, Liam. So if I can divide these into two, because we've got items 4 and 5 there. On the future of rail in the north, that points about a better service. Yeah, of course, that's very good. We want to grow the service, and we absolutely need that integration, because it's not going to happen. We're not going to get the growth unless we integrate our buses, our park and ride, our active travel, and that I'm very supportive of that proposal of the double devolution. I think there's a couple of things technically that are not beyond the wit of the team to have a look at when we talk about a single northern operator, not least, of course, that we're not in a unique position here, that we are on the edge of the north. We border Scotland, and we're actually closer to Edinburgh than we are to Manchester. And I'm sure people towards the south of the north have similar issues. So we just need to work them out technically, which I'm sure we can. And the point on the training academy, which I think is desperately needed. I mean, I think everybody agrees that we need to be stepping up driver training. So there's a Nexus Training Academy in South Shields, there's the Gateshead College Rail Academy in Felling, and I'm sure we would love to be part of that multi-site academy of the north. On the performance, I'm going to be somewhat less enthusiastic, I'm afraid. We in the north, we are in the northeast. Yes, we are a big city region with commuters. We also have a huge rural area. And I'm hearing stories of businesses not opening because their staff are missing. Of school children waiting on dark platforms for hours. I was at Hexham last night speaking to a public meeting there, and people are telling me there was a derailment. Derailment is unfortunate, and I'm not blaming anybody for that. But the bus service replacement from Northern isn't even turning up at stations. This is wholly unacceptable. And I'm hearing that there are issues with sickness amongst the drivers that are incredibly high, which clearly is something that there is a cause to that if it becomes a pattern. And a journalist was telling me yesterday of a number of suicides amongst train drivers. So there is clearly a deep problem here that needs fixing. And I'm sure we'll hear from a lot of other people with their hands up making similar points. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Jamie. That's very helpful. I might just at that point, though, bring Nick back in, if I may, because there's some very concerning issues, particularly in the northeast, of people being left without a service, and you know, those concerns of unstaffed stations and people not knowing what's happening, and rail replacement buses not turning up. Nick, can you come back on that, please? Because that's obviously very concerning from a northeast angle, or anywhere else that it might be occurring.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Mayor Driscoll, thank you for the frankness in terms of that feedback. Certainly, I recognise some of those, and really sorry for the impact on the communities that you've referred to there. The two specific points I pick up. So, in terms of the sickness point, it is an enormous element of focus for at the moment. I think I mentioned the numbers earlier in terms of some level of improvement in that area, and our regional director there at the moment has that agenda firmly in her sights to get that addressed and back to a point where we can resiliently deliver the service in the northeast. So absolute level of focus with the local management team there to drive that through. On the bus replacement services, we are having challenges in the northeast and some other locations on the network at recruiting bus replacement services. I think you mentioned the specific derailment issue there at Petrel Bridge, Carlisle. Forecast is towards the end of this month for that line to be back open, and we're doing all we can in terms of recruiting of bus replacements for that. I know the weekend just gone, that was a significant challenge with some of the challenges within those bus companies in terms of resourcing those. So that was a particular difficulty this weekend that we are working through with those suppliers at the moment, but remains a challenge. I have to be honest, it does remain a challenge in terms of the ability to recruit bus replacement services across the north of England.
I'll just let Jamie come back on that point. So.
Thank you. Nick, one of the things that matters more than anything else is that people are informed. If you turn up at a railway station or a bus replacement and then nothing turns up, people are having to pay for taxis, and in rural areas that's prohibitively expensive. So I appreciate that you don't want sickness either, of course you don't. But can you really pull out all the stops to make sure that everybody is fully informed? And if that involves one of your team turning up in a car and sticking a bit of paper up so people know what's happening, can you please do that? Because then people at the very least can make up plans.
I'll absolutely take that on board, and then certainly all of the data says information during disruption is one of the most important things for customers. So, yeah, I will absolutely take that up and take that back to the team in terms of seeing what we can do to improve that position.
Thanks, Nick. And obviously, yeah, because that sort of particular line looks like that disruption is going to go on for a few more days. If you can ask your regional director to link in closely with Jamie and Keith and others that are affected, I think that would be very helpful. Andy.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the operators for the updates. But I'm afraid I'm not going to be positive at all. The service standards we've had in the second half of this year have been truly appalling. It's had a ruinous effect on people's lives, on people's businesses, on our economy as a whole. There's just no way you can get away from that, Liam. It's loaded more cost onto people in a cost of living crisis. And I would say there is a real risk for the industry that people are losing trust in the trains. That's what we are seeing in Greater Manchester. There are more cars on the roads. Congestion has increased because more people are driving again. And I think the thing we've got to remember, Liam, there's a risk of déjà vu here, isn't there? Because I think it's been worse, actually, in the last couple of months than it was in May 2018. That's certainly the analysis that I've been given. The level of cancellations, particularly on TransPennine, just extraordinary numbers of cancellations. So just no service on some mornings. But even in between, it's not been good. When we went into the pandemic in late 2019, Christmas going into the pandemic, it was appalling standards of service on TransPennine. So if we look over the period, people in the northwest of England have had a really unreliable, poor service for the best part of 5 years. That is the reality of the situation. And there's just no getting away from that. And I think we need to hear more honesty from the industry about that. Now, I hear what people say about the pandemic this and the weather that and all the rest of it. So fair enough, there are external factors beyond your control. There are also government factors beyond your control, and we realise you're in a different world now with the contracting system. But there are factors that are under your control. And if we're to stop going through this déjà vu, we need to have honesty from you all about what percentage responsibility do you take for the appalling service that our residents have faced over a long period of time. I'm not saying it's all your responsibility, but some of it has to be your responsibility. And we need to hear more honesty from you about what have you got wrong? What didn't you do right over the last few years? And therefore, what are you going to change in terms of the way you provide services in our part of the world? Because we cannot carry on with what you are doing. It is nowhere near good enough. And I think once you give us that honesty, then we've got something to work with. All pointing fingers in different directions just doesn't work for us anymore. It's just not good enough. If the government bears the largest responsibility for what's been going on recently, well, we need to know that. If that is the case, if it's the nature of the contract you're now in, if it's a straitjacket you're working under, well, we need to know it because we need to fix it. There needs to be accountability here. And if it's not all your fault, well, let's make sure it's fair. And I guess, Liam, this builds to the question, given what I've just said, if lessons aren't being learned, if responsibility isn't being taken, if there isn't honesty, what confidence can we have about the December timetable that it will be better? As we've had this before, we've had promises before. that changes will make things better, and it hasn't. So we need to hear from you today. What can we take from this meeting today as to why things will be different with this time? So what have you learned? What have you got wrong that you're now going to put right? Because honestly, we just cannot carry on like this. It is beyond appalling at times. And people here have had year after year after year of this. And it is just not acceptable. So I'm sorry, Chair, but there's just no gloss that can be put on this. We need to hear honesty about why things have been so bad for so long, and in recent months worse than ever, which is an astonishing state of affairs that we've been in. We appreciate there's been problems on all transport systems, but not to this extent. And while I will give some allowance for industrial relations issues, weather, pandemic, yes, there's always some allowance that can be given. I want to hear, what do you three all take responsibility for? What % of this is your responsibility? What have you got wrong? And what have you changed to make sure that we can have more trust going forward? Because I've not heard it yet, and I need to hear it. Thanks, Joe.
That's great, Andy, and very, very important points. Let me ask first Steve to come in from an Avanti and TPE perspective on your percentage responsibility and the bits you're not responsible for, and if you can be candid about that, that would be very helpful. And also your confidence in what is going to actually be delivered in December. So I've asked Steve to come in first, then I'll ask Matthew, and then I'll ask Nick. So Steve, you first, please.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Look, Andy, we have had many conversations regarding this. Look, we always learn from these things. There's never anybody perfect in these situations. We have never said that we were perfect. We have got a situation of where the industry, well, and I'll talk about my own companies, Avanti and TPE, we had previously, particularly in TPE and Avanti before we take it over, there was a greater reliance on staff working additional hours to maintain the services, which we then allowed, if I can say, that to give us a false sense of comfort. And then when you don't have that, you're then very much exposed. And that's what we've seen over certainly over the last year with TPE in the last 6 months with Avanti. Now, what we have done to try and address that is put more drivers in. And I don't know if you caught a bit at the start, Andy. We have got more drivers now than we have ever had. And I think that's really important that we've got to now, as an industry, as my train operating companies, we have not got to be reliant on that going forward, because it gives us a false sense of security. And then when we see unfortunate things like this, whether it be COVID, whether it be people saying that they're unfortunately not available to work additional shifts, then we start to see ourselves exposed. And we're working our way out of that at this moment in time. And that's a bit that we've probably been very reliant on. So I think it's really important that we are no longer reliant on it. The work that we're doing to try and get towards December, we'll see us have more drivers, productive drivers, than we've seen for a long period in time. We're not fully there. We've still got a lot of training that's ongoing, both in Avanti and TPE. The diagrams and rosters are really important that we get them. One of the things that we have seen, certainly within the Avanti situation, is where we've got diagrams and rosters that are not very well balanced. And that throws days that you see, odd days like a Saturday, even in the reduced timetable, of where there's too many people off in rest days, and there's too many people during the week, that have not got productive work. So we're rebalancing that with the trade unions. We're working with them at this moment in time to try and make sure that when we get to December, there's a more even spread of people across the week. And that then stops this fluctuation. So that's another failing that we have got there, that we've allowed that situation not be as well managed as it should have been. And we've let people control it in a way it wasn't done in a bad way, don't get me wrong. It's not blaming people. It was just it made the industry, or made, certainly in Avanti's case, more reliant in rest day working. So we're trying to spread that about and make it better going forward. So these things are coming. As I say, we are discussing with the trade unions at this moment in time the new rosters, and we need them to work with us. And they are at this current time, and there's a lot of work going on this week. And that's the thing that we've got to continue to do, to try and make sure we grow out of this and we provide the level of service that we know that everybody needs and everybody wants. And we want to provide, please be assured that we want to provide a good service, particularly to our customers, but you as stakeholders for the important parts that you guys play in making sure that your regions and authorities are receiving the best rail service. So we are working towards that. I don't know, Matt, you want to give an update on TPE?
Well, Lynn, do you mind if I just quickly come back before?
No, that's okay, Andy, if it's brief. Yeah.
Because Steve, I appreciate what you've just said, and I appreciate the honesty, but we didn't get that honesty back in August. We got a line that said it was all the trade unions, and that wasn't helpful because it wasn't accurate. And that's why I'm saying that we can't work anymore without that degree of honesty. Otherwise, it ends up in a polarized situation. I think what you've got on this call are reasonable people who will hear reasonable explanations, but what we won't accept is being given a sort of a line that is a public line that wasn't accurate. And I just don't think that was right. But I hear what you say today, and I appreciate what you say, and I understand the moves that you've taken, and they sound like they're the right ones. But I need to sorry to come back in, Liam, but what I have to press you on is, what are you today saying that we can be highly confident in Manchester that there will be 3 trains to London by December, and that will be introduced, it will be sustainable, and that a high degree of confidence will be able to return with regard to people being able to book those services and use those services, and we won't see any backsliding from that. Is that what you're saying?
So what I'm saying, Andy, is we have got enough drivers who are trained, productive drivers, that should allow us to introduce that timetable from December. It is subject to the trade unions agreeing the rosters. As I spoke earlier on, this even spread of people at work each day, and making sure we don't have big pockets of people all off on a Friday, Saturday and Monday. And that's what we're working with the trade union guys at the moment. Those are negotiable. We are negotiating with them, and we hope to come to a sensible solution with that we can allow us to give us that level of certainty using the drivers that we have, because it's a 7-day railway we operate, and we have to make sure we've got the same amount of staff there over 7 days to cover the work content, and that's what we're working on at the moment. And if we get those agreements,
has got to be when it's based on negotiations with the trade unions. If a public position is taken that isn't balanced with regard to who's responsible for problems, it sets back the prospect of getting a negotiation with those same people. And I think that's what happened in August. And I just want an assurance that those negotiations will be handled in a better way than they clearly have been handled in the past.
We have, as I say, we have been trying to give the trade unions everything in advance. They will be carried out in a sensible manner. That's the important thing. We do, I've said to everybody all along, we had no other problems in Advantage other than the national dispute. And then obviously something changed. We have still not had a full understanding of what that was. The situation at the moment is we are trying to restore, we have, in my eyes, restored normality as best we can. We need the trade unions to work with us. We need management to do the right things and be sensible in their negotiations. And that is what's happening at this moment in time.
Chair, I don't wish to prolong this, and I see other hands up, so I won't. But what I have heard today is there's still no guarantee about 3 trains per hour, Manchester to London from December, and that is I consider that to be a very worrying position to find ourselves in after everything that we've been through since August.
So, but again, just to be clear, the timetable for December has got 3 trains an hour into Manchester. What I'm highlighting to you is, if we do not agree rosters, then that'll make it more difficult to deliver that in a consistent manner. But we are planning to put 3 trains per hour back into Manchester from the December timetable. It's making sure we get that consistency and being able to deliver it on a day-to-day basis. And that's why we need that spread. What you don't want is, it's okay on a Monday, it's dreadful on a Friday, and it's a bit patchy on a Saturday. If we can get that even spread of rest days and spared staff across the week, that makes it more consistent. But the timetable is planned to come in with 3 trains per hour from December.
Okay, thanks for that, Stephen. Please make sure that you keep all of us appraised of how that is going over the next 3 to 4 weeks, because it is crucial for all of our communities.
I'll make sure, Liam, that I update everybody in the call, make sure everybody's kept abreast of things.
Okay, is there anything additional you want to add, Matthew? And I'll bring Nick in to answer Andy's specific question. Then we've got Susan, Charlie and Patrick, and then I'll draw this part to a close.
Well, Mayor Burnham talked about accountability. I think it's important as operators that we are answerable on behalf of the collection of all the roles that different parties play for the services that we give, and we need to be answerable for that. That's important, and it's important that people trust us, and I absolutely recognise that, and my team absolutely recognise that. Bringing the rail services to life it's a collaboration. It involves the operators, it involves Network Rail, it involves TFN members and RMP members, it involves the DFT, and it involves trade union colleagues, and we have to work hard together to bring all of that together to deliver a resilient service. Now, I did say in May, and I think it's up until the autumn of last year, TP had its best ever period of performance, sustained performance, for 18 years. And we've not been able to replicate all of the circumstances this year. And I said earlier, I'm sorry for the service that we've given. I mean, a lot of the focus, ever since I joined the business in June, we have been working very, very hard, June last year, very, very hard. And there was work already in hand to get the route and traction knowledge backlog overcome and to recruit and train. And that's what we've been doing ever since. The challenge, as I said earlier, is that because of TIU and because of the importance of the December timetable, we could not take the foot off the gas on the training in what has been a difficult and challenging year. We needed to do it because of the importance of the December timetable and because we need to deliver MRTF, which this committee has set a lot of store in. So that's why we've had to do what we've done. We've made real progress. There's more to come, and we will be dropping in train crews, as I said, every week continuously, all the way through to the spring and beyond. I think Andy's challenge about being open and honest. I believe I have in all of the discussions that I've had with stakeholders and local authorities this year about what it takes to create a resilient operation, and the things that are in our control and the things that are not in our control. But I can assure you, Mayor Burnham and others, we are working absolutely flat out to deploy the cards that are in our hand and ask others to give support where they need to. Thank you.
Yeah. Nick, can you give Northern's perspective, please?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mayor Burnham, for those comments. I think my reflections, I feel absolutely accountable for the delivery of the timetable and for the delivery of the timetable change in December 22 from a Northern perspective. And I think I would reflect there are some things which are different this time round than there were in May 2018. So the planning arrangements for the timetable and the timetable structure and its interplay with the infrastructure, I think, is in a very different place to 2018. The relatively modest infrastructure that's required for the delivery of this timetable is on track for completion. Most of it is completed. There are a number of platform extensions, pieces of depot works and so on, which are completed. In fact, as recently as just in the last week, test train into Manchester International Depot to demonstrate that is ready to support the December 22 timetable. The most critical part for us in its delivery is in the train crew, and once all the unit plans and so on are done, is in the train crew resourcing arrangements. And others have talked about the roster negotiations, which are currently in flight. They are on track for us. That's an entirely normal process at this time out from a timetable change. The work that we had a disagreement, a dispute which ran and I referred to was concluded at the end of October. But the conclusion of that dispute did put some enablers in place to ease the negotiations for the December 22 rostering arrangements for us. So that's in flight. It has to be completed. I'm relatively confident that will be completed positively, and we'll work through that with trade union colleagues. But it's not being done in a confrontational way, which is likely to stir that up. That is using our established negotiating approaches there. I think the one thing I'd reflect on is clearly we've been working without rest day working for a time. That isn't entirely in our control. Some of that has fallen out of a tighter financial position that we're in. But that is, I don't want, Mayor Burnham, I don't want to be heard to point fingers at that. That is a context that we are working within, and we are navigating the December 22 timetable change within that context.
Nick,
Ideally,
if I could just interrupt you on that, then,
yep.
that we need to know about that tighter financial position. Now, I know there may be conditions that the department put you under, but if that is driving the poor performance, we need to get to the heart of that, and we then need to take it where it needs to go, which is to the government. There's no point in us coming here and having a go at all of you if you're actually saying to us it's the contract terms that we can't live with to make us provide. If that is the truth, you need to tell us that, because otherwise we'll just go round and round in circles on this. Yeah. If the straitjacket you're now in post-pandemic means that we have to have an unreliable service in the northwest of England, we need to know that.
Yeah, I think in fairness, if I can come in, Andy, we're going to cover that a little bit later on in the agenda, and a lot of this will also kind of depend upon what the Chancellor Exchequer may or may not do this Thursday as well. I think that's the backdrop to some of this as well. But you're absolutely right; it's a vital kind of issue as part of this as well. Nick, is there anything you wanted to?
No, I'll just build on that point. Our approach in that context has been to adjust the service promise to endeavour to protect the resilience. So certainly on the east of the Pennines, that led to our slight service reduction back in May, and those services that we're putting back in December, and that enabled the reduction in our training burden by about 25% for route and traction knowledge through the last year or so.
Okay, thanks, Nick.
Okay, thank you, Nick.
Susan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much. So, and we've obviously all heard Mayor Burnham's frustration about services in the northwest there, and obviously that frustration is shared at this side of the Pennines as well. The Trans-Pennine Express service in particular has caused a lot of frustration, particularly for places like Slough and Marsden, which is the only operator there servicing those places. So when that fails, there is no other alternative, and that has been an extreme frustration to people who live there and obviously need to get to work. So all these, and we've discussed this, we've heard this already in this meeting, have a massive social and economic impact on our place. And in a time when we need growth, we need to do some quantification really of what this means every time a service blobs, every time there's a change in service that leads to a bus replacement service. What does that impact on the economy? Because if operators are now going into a period where they're having to negotiate with government about funding, government needs to know how much damage they're doing to the economy if they don't fund Northern Rail services appropriately. So I'd just like to ask Rail North really if we can do some work on establishing what the economic and social costs are of services not running on time and unreliably, and then we can actually see what happens when those services are withdrawn. I mean, obviously, for the last year, Northern Rail had to cut its services back in Bradford district. Now, I know that's had an economic impact, but I'm not able to measure that. Have we got the tools to measure that, to show the impact of reduction in services? Because I think that's where we're at. We need to monetize it. Otherwise, if we can't monetize it, then government won't listen, and they need to hear the numbers. Treasury need to hear the numbers for what damage could potentially happen here if this situation continues. So that's an ask of Rail North, really. Secondly, I just want to make sure that we all sort of are cited on the Rail Academy proposal. I think it is really positive that we need to do something around training, and I'm positive about the will to do that. I just want to make sure that is driven by a group of combined authorities across the north, so we all have skills leads. Let's get them together to make sure we tap into the existing infrastructure rather than create something new, because this needs to move quickly at pace, and as you know, we're all short of money. It can't cost an awful lot of money, so let's make the most of the existing infrastructure. And I'd welcome an early meeting of combined authority skills leads with the rail operators to get that moving in a pragmatic way as quickly as possible. Thank you.
That's great, Susan. I think two very practical points that you raised there. I'm sure we can facilitate that second point about getting that skills academy for train drivers and other railway skills up and running with all of the combined authorities and other localities of the north. David or Martin, do you quickly want to make the point about the way we can sort of monetize the impact? Because you mentioned that TPE's performance is costing the north of England's economy £2 million a week. But what more can we do to make that more granular on an area by area basis as well?
I think good advantage, we have got the models and tools to do this, and I think what we can do now is bring in effect three measures together. So that was the cost of delays from poor performance. We've got in the paper some figures on the wider social benefits. So that's the kind of, for Northern, it's £2.50 for every pound invested. We've got some TPE figures now. We're going to spread that across the north. But I think Councillor Hinchcliffe referred to what if you actually strip back rail services. Again, we haven't got that yet, but we can model that with the tools that we've got. So I think we'll bring all those kind of three big facts together into a kind of document for members to use, so we can make that commitment. And just on the academy, thanks. I've already had the contact from your own skills lead on the back of our earlier conversation. So definitely take that up. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Charlie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Firstly, I'd just like to thank you very much for the presentations that you've provided. I always think that if we're talking about December, then I do think that we do miss the point of a lot of the recovery that we've seen in the rail has been a leisure and a tourist-led recovery in the hotter months. And I do still think that we need to not only just look at what's happening now, but how are we going to really fix the Sunday problem? How are we going to get more trains to leisure and tourist destinations on weekends, and also late at night as well? And I just think that should always be in the forefront of our mind. If this is where the market of the passenger travel is shifting, we need to be chasing that market as an industry as best we can. The presentations that you've said today have been really positive again, and I think some of the comments that have already been made have maybe unpicked some of that positivity a little, and I get that. More drivers than ever before, lower cancellations, restoring services in December, but I don't know whether or not it's really our response to that is strong enough, and I don't know whether or not the recommendations that are before us are actually strong enough. I still have concerns over the capability for certain operators to step up in December. You still can't buy advance tickets if you want to go and visit your family this Christmas. There's more strike dates that are still being announced. So I do wonder whether or not, I worry that these promises that we're seeing in December are not going to get met. And I wonder whether or not the committee would support some changes in the words of the recommendations to actually say that if these promises in December are not met and these issues are not resolved, that we cannot continue to support the franchises in their existing state.
Thanks, Charlie. I think that's a very helpful suggestion, because as we've heard from everyone's contributions thus far, there's a hell of a lot of tangible frustration because of what it means for the travelling public of the North at this moment in time, with the fact that services are not where we want them to be. David obviously outlined what our kind of responsibilities are with regard to each of the existing operations, but obviously we have the ability to issue statutory advice on any and all of those to the Department of Transport. Whilst we cannot unilaterally take a franchise off any company, we can make our kind of feelings known as part of that statutory advice to the Secretary of State. So I would support what you're suggesting there. I'd hope everyone else would support that. And if I may just sort of say that, I think it's really helpful that you brought that forward, Charlie, because this isn't about parties and politics across the North. This is a cross-party concern from everyone across the North. So I think that's a very helpful suggestion that we can include accordingly. I'll bring Patrick in and then we'll be able to sum up, hopefully. So Patrick, over to you.
Well, thank you, Chair. And look, I think the operators will have undoubtedly understood the frustration. They know the frustration is there. You know, all eyes are on the 12th of December and what happens after. And the idea that there's only one service an hour from Manchester, and sometimes that is lost, is just totally unacceptable. You know, therefore the 12th of December is going to be very important as well. I just also, though, wanted to pick up what Jamie Risco said as far as information. I had to come and do a speech last week in York, and I was in Madrid. So I thought the best thing to do would be to fly back to Manchester rather than flying back to London. So I went from Manchester Airport across to York. That turned out to be a bit of a mistake. It would have been better probably to have flown back into London and than trying to fly back into Manchester. And really, that is just unacceptable, the way in which information is got across and got out to people. So let's please, I urge the operators to be on top of the information, particularly and where an incident like as the Carlisle incident, where there's a sort of a failure in the infrastructure, I think it is very important that that message is got across as to why those services aren't properly operating, because people do understand that. I don't know that when I was Secretary of State, I was always told never to refer to the suicides on the rail network, because if they were publicly referred to, actually it had a negative impact of pushing, giving people ideas. So one has got to be careful about the way in which this information is transfixed. And I realise that sometimes some of the disruption is beyond the control of the actual operators themselves. But I do urge you, please, to the reliability. I think what Andy was saying right at the beginning of people actually giving up on the rail services is something that we need to be very, very aware of. And they give up on the rail services if there's not reliability. So the 12th of the December timetable changes are going to be absolutely important. And of course, there is a TFN meeting on the 14th. So we'll see how the first 48 hours goes. But I just wanted to re-emphasise what I think were a number of positive points which were made by the mayors. Positive, but also requiring those fundamental changes that have been promised. I think if they fail to deliver, then it will be very difficult for us to be able, other than to do what Charlie has just outlined, which we don't want to do, because I don't think there are any instantaneous answers. We need to move forward and make sure that service is delivered. Thanks, Chair.
No, thanks, Patrick, and that's very helpful. I've seen Steve's indicated, so Steve, I'll give you the last word before I sum up.
Liam, it's just a very quick one. Sorry, I should have said there is 2 strike days called on at Vanti on the 11th and 12th of December, i.e. the start of the new timetable, and that's called by RMT. So just to make people aware of that, there will be hopefully we can resolve it, but it doesn't, it means it's an emergency timetable. It goes in the first 2 days. But just in case everybody walks away and says, why did that not mentioned? I should have mentioned it. But we are trying to resolve it with RMT. But So far, there doesn't seem to be any appeasement of the situation, but we're keeping working on it.
Okay, thanks for that, Steve. Thanks for clarifying that. Okay, if I look back round just to sort of close this item, because it's 2 agenda items in one, 4 and 5, and we've got effectively 5 recommendations which were on agenda item 4. One is seeking assurances from the Department for Transport that operators have got all the flexibilities that they require, and we will continue to do that. And if there are any blocks in the way that operators feel they have from central government, please make sure you let us know so we can, with you, lobby and push accordingly. Second item is about seeking support from the DFT for the business case for a training academy of the North, right across the North, including all of those combined authorities and county council areas across the North, particularly as Susan had suggested. Third item was work through the Rail North Partnership to hold the train operators accountable for their recovery plans and commitments. And I think that's where we need to strengthen the recommendations, isn't it, Charlie? That has to be about that if promises and pledges that are being made for December are not delivered, Transport for the North reserves its right to issue statutory guidance and advice to the Secretary of State about the future of those operations accordingly. And I probably should expand at this point that this is why candour and transparency is really important. You know, when I think back to May 18, I remember in the weeks prior to, nothing was said by anyone that kind of the timetable wasn't going to work. We got an email on the Friday from Northern saying there might be some short notice cancellations, but not a lot, don't worry about it. And then from the Sunday and the days and weeks that followed, everything fell apart. And it was that, frankly, conspiracy of silence that was almost as bad as the kind of awful service delivery that followed accordingly. So I think we've been very, very blunt about where we are as Transport for the North on that. But I think that's kind of an important way we beef up that recommendation. The fourth item is request that the executive prepare a proposition for consideration at the next board meeting, setting out how we can build on existing rail devolution and rail reform in the north of England. I think that's a really important point, because I'll just sort of make this point. It always strikes me that the problems we're talking about are not happening with the same magnitude in Scotland, Wales, and on Merseyrail. And one of the key reasons for that is that those railways are devolved and there is a more kind of thorough and kind of comprehensive approach towards them. So I do think if we had more devolution over the North Rail network, we would be in a stronger position to sort these issues than is currently the case, where so much of this is reserved matters for the Department for Transport. And then the fifth item is about continuing to make the case for funding that the North needs to support a growing railway. I know we're going to talk about that later in the short term on the agenda, but I think there's also an absolutely vital point, as Susan rightfully kind of mentioned, about the economic impact of a problematic service at the moment, but also the strong economic opportunity that if our services are invested in properly, we can grow the North's economy and give people up north a much better quality of life that flows from all of that. That's what a railway is here to deliver. It's not actually about just running trains back and forth. It's what it delivers for our public, our economy and our environment. So if we can agree all of those recommendations, and I'm not seeing any dissent, so we will take that forward accordingly. We are slightly over time, but it was vital we dealt with that issue comprehensively. So if we move on to the sixth item, which is the Manchester Task Force, David, if you can very briefly introduce this. I am taking most of this as read, and then Richard will summarise some of the kind of readiness for December 22, if it's not already been touched upon in the previous debate and discussion. So David, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. And you're right. I think we've touched on an awful lot of this. Hopefully, Richard will give a brief update. I think we just wanted to make sure, though, that going back to the reason for this timetable change and the reduction in some service in the Manchester area to make services more reliable is the lack of infrastructure. And there is an ongoing plan to put in infrastructure. The report thereby gives an update on the various short-term proposals, things like Salford, Manchester, Victoria, electrification schemes, and then the first sort of big intervention on the corridor, Manchester Oxford Road Station, with a business case due in 2023, and then work on further bigger interventions following on from that. So I think it's just worth bearing in mind that this is one of the major congestion hotspots in the north, and the reason for the December timetable change, and that infrastructure investment will allow service to be restored and ramped up along with the blueprint that you have seen previously. So we can provide more on that at a future meeting, but maybe I'll just hand over to Richard, who is chair of the Manchester Task Force, with an independent role really, and I think it'd be helpful if maybe just give us a few words about reminder of what that timetable change is doing, and then what his view on the readiness is.
Yes, thank you, David, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to come and address you on this. As we've just said, there are a number of themes in relation to implementation of the December timetable that have already been covered ably in the preceding items, but it's just worth recapping on the purpose of the new timetable and some of the things that we've been overseeing in terms of readiness. The new timetable is designed to improve the situation in relation to delays in central Manchester through reducing the congestion that really came to the fore in May 2018. And if I compare the December 2019 timetable, immediately pre-COVID, with this new timetable, there are fewer trains making complex routes across Manchester, which means less delay will be spread across the region. There are longer, but also fewer trains, more evenly spaced. And whilst that means an impact for some passenger journeys, for many, it's going to be a big improvement. So, for example, a train every 15 minutes between Manchester and Preston, a Liverpool-Manchester-Sheffield service every 30 minutes, and a much more even spread of trains to the airport. And those standardised service patterns also mean more even delivery of capacity for passengers, will allow for better interchange. And at the heart of the network, that means fewer trains with better spacing on the Castlefield corridor. I think as the foregoing presentation pointed out, however, passengers won't be making that comparison I've just made. They'll be looking at what's happening now. And so whilst December 2022 is a new timetable, it also forms part of the recovery path from COVID and is subject to the same service delivery issues that we've just been talking about. There are some important underpinning elements for the timetable, and they have been touched on. And the industry, through the task force, has been keeping a very close eye on readiness in relation to those. We have infrastructure works, some of which have been completed. Platform works at Oxenholme, Kentsbank and Dalton are complete. The last items are close to completion and are being monitored very closely. So Nick mentioned depot works at Manchester International. There's also an extension to the fueling point at Barrow, and there are platform works at Ulverston and Staveley to be completed over the next few weeks. Platform works at Earlham also, which were a late addition to the programme, will be complete by the 27th of December. And as we've said in the earlier discussion, alongside all of these works, train operators have been working to train drivers on new routes. But I think in terms of the specific risks that are brought about by the actions that are necessary to deliver the timetable, none give us significant cause for concern, and mitigations are available. And if there are any unexpected events in terms of the things that are being delivered between now and the 11th of December. But as we've already heard this morning, the fundamental critical requirement to deliver the timetable is available and fully productive staff. And I won't go into any further detail and re-rehearse what we've heard previously, but that's clearly a significant factor. But that issue that we've been talking about this morning is the case whatever timetable is planned to operate in December. And we shouldn't confuse those issues with the delivery of the new timetable. We do know the new timetable structure will perform better than the pre-COVID timetable structure. Just finally, the task force will be closely monitoring the implementation of the timetable and to check it delivers the outcomes that are expected, and we'll report the results back on that. So I'm going to stop at that point. I'm sure the listeners.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I've got Andy and Oliver, so Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Richard. Firstly, on your last point, Richard, I want just to know more from you about what does that mean, monitoring? What would be acceptable? What could this committee hold as a sort of level of punctuality, reliability, and cancellations that would mean the implementation had been a success or otherwise? You know, what is the sort of level of compliance we should be able to expect the new timetable? And therefore, what is the threshold if it falls outside of that it's not achieved its objectives? I think we need to have clarity on what is a success and what isn't a success when it comes to implementation. I think it's really important. I mean, I know the task force is set up for this purpose, but we do need to remind everybody on the call, this timetable was never accepted as anything other than a temporary measure until the north of England gets the infrastructure improvements it's long been promised. And that has to be understood as we go into this new timetable, because we are suffering a significant loss of service and connectivity as a result of this. So you've mentioned the infrastructure. As I understand it, the next timetable change after this one is going to come in 2025. And I think there are a number of potential improvements scheduled between 2022 and 2025, including turnbacks in Salford and one at Victoria. So can we have a kind of detailed timeline against those infrastructure improvements so this committee can monitor that they're being delivered to allow an enhanced timetable from 2025? Beyond that, there's a sort of stage 3 of improvements, which I understand is much more vague. And this takes us back to those old issues about 15 and 16 and all of that. So also, can the task force give us clarity on the timeline for those improvements as well, so that we can have some sense where we will be by 2030? And it's a bit ridiculous that we're sort of thinking about, you know, the timetable we were promised in 2016 or wherever it was, that will only actually be delivered by 2030. But that's what we need to have clarity about. And I'd be grateful for more, if you could give me some more confidence about the way those infrastructure improvements are being scheduled between 2022 and 25, and then 25 to 2030, so that, you know, we can not just be in a position where we have a permanently downgraded timetable. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Andy. Richard, 3 very specific points there. Can you address those for Andy, please?
Sure. So I think in terms of performance monitoring, you know, we'll be doing comprehensive analysis of performance pre the timetable change and post the timetable change, which will look at all of the detailed root causes. The one measure that is particularly important for the timetable is the level of congestion delay, and we'll be looking closely at that as a particular measure. The modelling that was undertaken showed that the new timetable should reduce that by 20%, and that's the measure that we're going to be monitoring. There is clearly an issue in terms of root cause analysis, and if that root cause is unavailability of drivers, that's not a relationship with the timetable itself. That's a relationship with the root cause of delay. So, yeah, I think we have to see that in that kind of context. So that's the first point. In terms of sorry, was someone saying anything?
No, I don't think they were, Richard. Don't worry.
Okay. I mean, today we are obviously focusing on December 22 timetable. David Hogarth earlier touched on the blueprint as the means by which we are developing the plans for the railway in Manchester and the investment plans for the future. There is, as you said, an opportunity with electrification schemes on the northwest quadrant out of Manchester coming to fruition, and those works in Salford and Victoria that you mentioned for a further change in 2025. And in terms of beyond that, Network Rail is producing a piece of work which will be published in the spring to provide a further update to hopefully remove that vagueness that you described for that beyond 2025 timeframe.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Oliver.
Thanks, Chair. Hi, Richard. Just conscious. I mean, I welcome the sort of update and the work that's gone into it, but I'm just conscious, and I'm afraid I'm just going to keep on banging this drum, that Sheffield is the biggest
city in the developed world not to have a rail link to its international airport, and Doncaster is the second biggest city. And that is all the more pressing given the situation we're facing at Doncaster Sheffield Airport, which is now in the process of closing down. So I think just it feels to me like the infrastructure development that is required, and you touched on it in your last answer, to kind of get that rail link back is receding further into the future. And I just welcome a bit of an update on that and your view. And equally, just wanted to sort of press the point that South Yorkshire isn't as involved in this process as I think I would probably like. So any opportunity for South Yorkshire to be more engaged in the task force would be welcome, because we certainly want a third fast train to Manchester, clearly the airport link. There are other kind of works going in there, and I think it would be good for South Yorkshire to be a bit more engaged and involved. So if my officers could maybe make contact and find a way to be more engaged, that would be appreciated.
Thanks, Oliver. I think we can definitely make sure that your team are properly involved, because I think we all understand the centrality of particularly your airport link, but actually all those other kind of longer distance links for Sheffield as one of the real big important cities of the north. But Richard, do you want to come back on the specific point about when Sheffield could have the infrastructure that allows the return of an airport service to them regularly?
Yeah, I mean, I think the work the task force has been doing in supporting the investment business cases for the future, is looking at a series of services that have been removed either in December 2022 or before that through COVID. The economic value clearly of a South Yorkshire and beyond link to Manchester Airport is understood. That service, as we've rehearsed previously, is a user of network capacity in the way it operates into and out of Manchester Piccadilly. With investment, that might change in future, but fundamentally, that service is understood and is on the list of services that are being considered as part of the business cases for future investment.
Okay, thanks, Richard. I think we do need a bit more focus on that, though. I think we need something a bit more definitive.
Do you mind? Can I just quick?
Absolutely, Oliver, go for it. Yeah.
Just at the risk of demeaning politicians, but I speak as one that was a bit of a political answer, if you don't mind me saying, Richard. And as the chair says, I think a bit more clarity would be welcomed.
Okay, Matthew, I think your hand just went up at the same time. Is it related to this point?
Yes, it is, Chair. I mean, we've had discussions with the airport this year. I'm meeting to get them again later this week, Mayor Coppard, and as part of our business plan next year, we've committed to working with the airport. In fact, we asked that we had a commitment to work with the airport because to look at how we might create a pathway to getting more services back to the airport. It was an important market for TPE. I hear it as a strong message from stakeholders. So apart from working with the airport, we'll be working with others around this virtual table on that, because I think it's an important piece of work, and I think it's an important question. Hope that gives you some reassurance. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew.
Richard, could I ask you?
Go on, Oliver. Yeah.
Sorry, Chair.
No, it's fine.
I just wondered if Richard, I could maybe ask you just to sort of write to me and lay out the sort of steps that are being taken and sort of next steps, so that we can understand that in a bit more detail. That would be appreciated.
Happy to do that.
Yeah,
thank you.
And perhaps I can suggest, Matthew, if you want to link in with Oliver and his team, because if you're able to find some form of train path within the existing infrastructure, that would be a vital, quicker win that the people of Sheffield and South Yorkshire desperately need. So if we can allow you to do that, that would be great. Susan.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think we all recognise that this work of the Manchester Task Force has been really invaluable and needed, because this corridor really affects the whole of the north, doesn't it? And I just sort of echo Oliver's points for West Yorkshire as well, of course, because you'll see on page 32, 3.12 paragraph that TPE services Leeds to Manchester Airport will terminate now at Manchester Victoria, so no direct contact there. And of course, Bradford, where I'm sitting at the moment, was promised a direct link to the airport 3 years ago, which of course has not been realised. And actually, Manchester Airport came to see me last week to talk about them wanting to get more people in the north of England, but of course they had to drive here because it was going to take too long to come on public transport. So it rather underlined the point we were all trying to make. So I think, you know, we're all trying to get to the airport quicker, and it will support our economies. And therefore, if we can really focus on that economic driver for this side of the Pennines, that would be really, really helpful. I think also this model, I'm just reflecting actually, is something I'd like to see replicated in West Yorkshire as well, because there are a number of issues we've got that need infrastructure joining up with timetabling, and therefore having DfT directly involved in some of those issues would really help us. I mean, I'm thinking I've got a deadline of 2025 here in Bradford. We're going to be UK City of Culture, and I'm still waiting for government to decide on monies to invest in a new platform at Foster Square. That's 2 years to put a new platform there, and they've not sanctioned the money yet. So actually, I think regionally there are a few joinings up that we need to do, and I think this model is really good to replicate in other parts of the north, and I would very much welcome West Yorkshire being the first of those.
Lovely. Thanks, Susan. David, I think you're probably best placed to come back on that. I know the next report will talk about the Leeds area study, but the opportunity to do something that may be kind of bigger and more encompassing of the whole of West Yorkshire. Can you come back on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think absolutely once we get that Leeds terms of reference, there's so many interlinked issues around the Leeds and Bradford areas that I think that's a really good suggestion. Just to pick up Mayor Coppard's point as well, I'll absolutely make contact with the officers there. We've worked really well with Mayor Burnham's officers in Manchester, and we've used a lot of local data and information. So absolutely do the same with Mayor Coppard's office as well. I think, going back to Mayor Burnham's point, I think bringing back this programme linked to the blueprint when Network Rail have completed the work that is going on around this Tranche 3 work as well, so everything is laid out, I think is absolutely clear to giving this committee the certainty, and that is promised for the first part of next year. I'd like to see it sooner, but that is the current timeline they're working on. And the second thing is, I really want to give this committee input to the services that are prioritised for bringing back as and when infrastructure comes online, and we've been developing some tools and modelling that bring in the wider social and economic benefits, not just the revenue, not just the kind of operational benefits, and balance all those things. So I think probably at the next meeting, Chair, we'll be able to provide something on that, so you actually get some genuine input to that at the early stages of development.
That's very helpful. Thanks, David. Richard, do you want to make one final point and then we'll move on?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on this point about train services to the airport, because I think it's one of the challenges that we really have grappled with in the task force. I think the north of England is really lucky in terms of the network configuration in Manchester, which allows the opportunity for many places to be connected to the airport. And what we've been trying to do is find a balance between providing as many places with a through service to the airport on the one hand, and making sure that the rail network is set up to deliver high performance on the other. And that's a real challenge, and I just wanted to sort of share that, I think, because I think it just helps with the debate.
Yeah. And that is helpful, Richard, and it's all about making sure we've got the capacity to make sure all of those things can be delivered as soon as possible, not just in the years ahead. Susan, do you want to make a very, very final point and then
just to say we need Northern Powerhouse Rail, because an existing infrastructure can only do so much, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
No ifs, no buts, and I think we all agree with that 100%. Okay, let's, if we can, agree the recommendations on page 31, if that's agreed. Not seeing any dissent, so let's move on to item number 7, which is the East Coast Mainline update. I think, Caroline, are you going to very briefly present this, but we'll take it as read accordingly. So, Caroline, are you there?
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Good. So, for those of you who've read the report provides an update or note on the position of the Leeds area study. So on the East Coast Main Line, both TfN, Transport North East, local authorities and businesses have been seeking an increase in the capacity on the York to Newcastle section of the line for some time, and various studies have been undertaken. To note, the most recent was a strategic outline case, which was co-funded by Transport North East, TfN and Network Rail. The case looked at what infrastructure was needed that would allow the route capacity to be raised from 6 trains to 7 or 8 trains per hour. And the project is now progressing to the next stage, which is the outline business case. And it's been incorporated within the governance of the overall integrated rail plan development. On timetabling, 2 proposed timetables have been consulted upon since 2021, and work taken by our consultants concluded that whilst the most recent draft timetable provided additional capacity benefits in some parts of the region, it did not deliver the requirements of all our partners and stakeholders. Before any such revised timetable could be introduced, a ministerial decision is required. And since writing the report, Transport for the North understands that a decision will not be forthcoming in time to introduce a new timetable into 2023. Governance of infrastructure works is managed via the East Coast Mainline Programme Board, and it was noted in the May 22 report to Ranelagh Committee that Transport North East had written to ministers in relation to setting up an East Coast Mainline Integrated Rail Programme Board North East. DfT has indicated that the main governance at officer level would continue to be through the existing East Coast Mainline Programme Board, and that Transport for the North should be able to participate in this board. As you will note, the report recommends that Transport for the North writes to the Department for Transport to seek inclusion of Transport for the North on the East Coast Mainline Programme Board. Transport for the North continues to support cross-industry work alongside West Yorkshire Combined Authority and the City of Bradford Metropolitan District Council to increase the number of LNER services by up to 6 trains a day between Bradford, Leeds and London. The plan remains for these services to be delivered in time for Bradford hosting the UK City of Culture in 2025. So in summary, the recommendations for the East Coast Mainline element of the report are that the committee notes the update on industry work to reintroduce the revised timetable on East Coast Mainline and further infrastructure enhancements, and that Transport for the North writes to the Department for Transport to seek inclusion of Transport for the North on the East Coast Mainline Programme Board. Coming to the Leeds area study, the report notes that the government's integrated rail plan commits to look at the most effective way to run HS2 trains to Leeds, including the best solution for Leeds station capacity, and starting work on the West Yorkshire Mass Transit system. The HS2 to Leeds study will be guided by terms of reference set by the DfT, and as David just mentioned, these are yet to be published. To support the study, West Yorkshire Combined Authority has established a Leeds Area Studies Board, which is chaired by Network Rail and includes partners from West and South Yorkshire, government departments, East Midlands councils and Midlands Connect. And transport plays a key role in this board. The recommendation in the report is that the committee notes the updates on the Leeds area study. Thank you, Chair.
Lovely, thank you, Caroline. I've got Susan.
Thanks, yeah. I welcome the paper, obviously, but it's just infuriating. This takes all just too long. Everything takes too long, and time ticks by, and there are some deadlines that can't be moved, like 2025, and we do have this programme board in place, but we do need more DfT involvement in that regarding the infrastructure. The fact that it's taken a year for them, and they've still not responded to the IRP stuff, instead of setting out the terms of reference of that Leeds City Region study, it's just slowing everything down. Did government not have some kind of Northern Acceleration Board at some point that Grant Chat's run? Is that still running? Is there a way to raise this stuff up a bit further to say, look, we need to get on with this really quickly, because if they don't make decisions, costs are going up, opportunities are being lost, and then they're going to wonder, why the economy is not working. So there was a Northern Acceleration Board. Is it still working? Is this something that can be raised at that? And can we learn from the Manchester Task Force to do something in West Yorkshire to really unlock some of these? Because we could all be getting on with this, and instead we're just waiting and waiting and waiting. So any help on accelerating all this will be really welcome. Thank you.
Is that one for Martin or Patrick to come back on?
Maybe I can come back on that, Chair. I think it's fair to say we know and we share frustrations of the members of this committee on that. I think it's also fair to say we saw in a previous set of administration, I can't remember quite which number it was, but when we had the Secretary of State Grant Shapps, it was clear that the ministerial team within the department were anxious to get the terms of reference out. I think it was a function of getting cross-government approval for it. I would hope that now we have some stability and a new team at the department, they would be able to get into a place where they could release the terms of reference very quickly. I think it's pressing now with the current ministerial team to get what we know probably exists to be released. Maybe that is something that we'll see after the financial statement on Thursday, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Perhaps we also want to follow that issue up with a letter to the new Secretary of State just to remind accordingly. Oliver, do you want to come in?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I usually try and sort of let others, if others have said what I'm intending to say, I don't want to just sort of grandstand, but I think just on this point in particular, I might have to, I'm afraid. I think, not least because I was on a train between Sheffield and Leeds this morning, which was unsurprisingly overcrowded and delayed. That second train between Sheffield and Leeds is fundamentally important and, seems to be kind of, again, caught up in huge delays. And as Susan said, no good reason as far as I can tell why we can't get on with some of this. On the study, more broadly, I just think it is so incredibly frustrating that we face this kind of interminable delay. And as Martin says, it's probably sat in a drawer, figuratively sat in a drawer somewhere, just waiting for somebody to actually pluck up the courage to actually put it online. I sort of despair really, and I'm happy to wait until Thursday to see what comes. But if on Thursday we don't have some progress there, I just do think we, collectively, and I can do this with Susan, Tracy, but also through TFN, writing to the government and making clear our disappointment and frustration feels like the least really that we should be doing in that space.
And I think that's a very helpful suggestion, Oliver, if we can pull something collectively together that yourself and Susan and Tracy confront, I think that would be great, because without wanting to bore people of the annals of time, when I used to work at Sheffield railway station, another fast train from Leeds to Sheffield was vital, and that was 17 years ago. So that just shows how long things take, frankly, and that's not acceptable in the slightest. Okay, if we can note that report accordingly and move on to item 8, which is the Resilience and Reliability Delivery Plan. I know David's going to introduce this. I hope it's reasonably non-controversial, so we can take it as read and accept accordingly. But David, is there anything that you want to briefly introduce it with?
Sorry, which David? I was going to do the
David Worsley. I've got so.
Yes, I can quickly run through what the main points here are. I think the thing to note about performance in the north is it's definitely a levelling up issue, because it's not even as though train performance in terms of on-time percentage and so on is just on average lower in the north. It's basically that all of our train operators are pretty much uniformly worse performing than other parts of the country. So we've got 24 train operators now, and sort of the bottom 11 are all ones which either almost all or significantly have operations in the north, whereas the top 7 highest performing train operators are all ones which have no portion of their operations in the north at all. So there's pretty much no overlap really between train performance in the north and elsewhere in the country. So it's definitely a levelling up issue, and also our research suggests there's a very strong correlation between train performance and customer satisfaction. So if we're going to attract people back onto rail, improving performance is an absolute priority. Now, the main thing that we could do to improve rail performance would be to get Northern Powerhouse Rail and improve the connections between the main cities, because our main pinch points in the north are Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, and to a lesser extent York and Doncaster. So improving the main services between these cities and reducing the amount of knock-on delays would be the single most important thing we could do. But then looking at other causes of train delay, really there's no magic bullet, because there's many different causes for poor performance. The statistics categorise them into 11 different types of cause, but there is no one type which is more than about 1/6 of the delay minutes. So in order to address this, our rail outputs officer has worked with the TOCs and with Network Rail and identified 121 smallish interventions across the north that we think could be made to improve performance. They're in lots of different categories. The single biggest category, the 31, is changes to platform layouts and equipment, but there's also the line speed improvement programme, which a few of you will be aware of, improvements to signalling and interlocking, just changing the odd signal here and there, that sort of thing. And we've identified 13 of those as priorities that we think could be implemented in the short to medium term. So what we want to do is work with Network Rail to progress these and seek devolved funding, possibly through Network Rail, in order to fund some of these performance improvements. And we have had an undertaking from one of the strategy and planning teams at Network Rail to go through the full list of 121 suggestions and respond to us in detail about that, which is something that happened just last week. So that's a good development, and I know that Cara Wood, who's on this call, is also now aware of this and wanting to cooperate with us on it.
Lovely, thanks for that, David. I'm not seeing any indications that anyone wants to come in on this, so I'll just sort of move the recommendations if we're all agreeable to that. Yeah, that's great. In that case, we can move to our final item, so I'll just kind of exclude the press and public accordingly, moving the relevant motion from the 1972 Local Government Act, if that's agreed. Yep, and Gary, can you just confirm when we've switched